Hi there. Welcome to the LaunchDarkly Software Release Summit. We're excited to have you join us today for a set of sessions discussing how modern software teams are shipping faster and with less risk. I'm John Kodumal, CTO and co-founder at LaunchDarkly. Joining me today is Liz Fong-Jones, Field CTO at Honeycomb. She'll be sharing some of her insights on how modern teams are releasing their software and some of the trends and practices she's seeing in 2023 and beyond. Liz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
I would love to spend a few minutes learning a little bit more about Honeycomb and the great work you're doing there. You're Field CTO at Honeycomb, and I know that's a role that not a lot of people have familiarity with, so tell us a little bit about what that entails.
Sure. So Honeycomb is a company that helps software teams understand what's really happening in their production environments. So we are a company that provides observability as a software as a service solution, but we think more generally in terms of the socio-technical picture. How are your software teams able to release with confidence and be able to understand subtle user behavior and system behavior, regardless of how many microservices you have, how many different endpoints you have, what the number of users that you have is, and kind of really thinking about how do we dig in and analyze the behavior of systems where there are many different dimensions and many different possible values for those dimensions, such that you can't really use traditional time series metrics anymore, and you have to take a different approach to really being able to trace and understand the behavior of what's actually happening. So in terms of the field CTO role, I'm relatively new to that, having been promoted in October. And I really come from this lens of wanting to make sure that Honeycomb works for the most sophisticated use cases. So thinking about our largest clients, thinking about the most demanding software development teams, and making sure that we are equipping those teams to ship more rapidly and with more confidence, regardless of where they're starting from, to kind of meet people where they are and bring them into the future, and to help them scale to massive demand. So this means everything from doing show and tells of how Honeycomb uses Honeycomb, because we are kind of one of the larger scale customers of Honeycomb, because of that kind of embracing of our big data solution as a mechanism of debugging software systems. So kind of showing clients what's possible with Honeycomb is one thing that I do, as well as really making sure that we're talking about the whole picture. We're helping make sure that people are meeting their business objectives and understanding where's Honeycomb truly having an impact on their business and helping their developers be higher productivity.
Liz, we're going to spend some time talking about the state of software releases in 2023. One of the things that we've observed, especially with our customers, is that things are shifting back into more of the sort of like pre-pandemic mindset in a lot of ways. And we're also seeing a lot of challenges with respect to the changes in macroeconomic conditions. So there's, as we see it, a set of new challenges that engineering leaders are facing in 2023. Can you speak to some of the things that you're seeing out there with customers?
Certainly. I think that, as you've alluded to, the macroeconomic challenges mean that software development leaders are being tasked to do more with less, whether it be having headcount freezes and not being able to hire as many people as they were hoping for, or having to cut their cloud budgets. There are a lot of areas where companies previously were saying, we're just going to spend our way out of this and revenue will solve the problem eventually. Instead, we're having to be a lot more cost conscious and think carefully through, is this expenditure actually moving the reliability needle? Is it actually helping us deliver software faster? And to cut back in areas where we're doing undifferentiated heavy lifting. Because it may seem appealing when your headcount is paid out of a separate budget as your services spend to just spend headcount on things. But we now know that that's not tenable anymore, that it's a lot better of an idea to focus on what's really truly differentiating for your own company, and then to work on incorporating outside tooling in order to address things that are better solved by common solutions. I think the other piece that you're touching on is how we spent the pandemic basically in this weird state of figuring out and adapting and figuring out, how are we going to adjust to a remote first world, and is it going to be a temporary remote first world or a permanent remote first world? And while there are some companies that are trying to call their workers back to the office, I think that ship has sailed, and that we have started to figure out what are some of the best practices for working and kind of working in decentralized teams, whether it be with collaboration tools like Slack, whether it be by having chat ops and kind of sharing the state of what's going on in production, right? That these are things that are no longer context that is transmitted from person to person, staring over each other's shoulders at computer screens located in the same office.
It sounds like in this new world with this new set of challenges, engineering teams need to spend more time and be a little bit more rigorous about some of the decisions that they're making in terms of like what we're investing in, what projects we're investing in, or even on the build versus buy side of things. Is this worth buying, or should we build this ourselves? And what is the true cost there?
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and this speaks to the idea of there is value in having a platform team that is thinking about what are our golden paths, how do we weave this together into a narrative around what's the best practice for how we do things at a company. But I don't think that that team needs to build it all themselves. They just need to model out what does this look like, how do all of these things integrate together, and how do we make sure that we see adoption across the entire enterprise of the solutions that we're building so that we don't wind up with fragmentation.
You've done a lot of great work around developer advocacy, and I think the topic that we've been talking about, efficiency, it really connects to especially internal developer advocacy. Have you seen enterprises shifting into that to drive efficiency among their engineers?
There is a phenomenon of enterprises typically, having 5 or 10 different ways of doing something because teams are not talking to each other, and then you've got a platform team that's off building their, 11th way of doing things. And at a certain point, you have to really stop and get everyone to talk to each other and make sure that the product that's being developed by the platform team, because fundamentally platform teams build products that are just internally consumed, that you have to make sure that it's meeting the developers' requirements, that people are aware of the platform itself, that they're migrating their workloads to use that platform and to use the best practices that come with it, rather than going off and building their 12th or 13th different way of solving the same problem.
One of the things I've seen is that some of these platform leaders, adoption has been really challenging. What are some of the tips or best practices for people in those seats to make sure that the investments that they're making to drive internal engineering efficiency are actually being adopted within the organization?
I think that rotating in and out of individual teams that are supposed to be using the platform is a key mechanism of developing empathy for what your developers are going through, so that you are delivering things that are on target and that are actually going to get practically adopted. And also that kind of encourages that cross-pollination so that people know that it's not just, here's our faceless developer team with a bunch of API docs, but that they're the people within the company that you can talk to about how do we do things at our company.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any trends or technologies that you're particularly excited about or that you see as emerging, especially around the idea of releasing software?
So I think that we are past the era of saying, okay, we're just going to slap some continuous integration and continuous delivery on it. Because as I think I've said previously, when you ship shit faster, you ship shit faster. And we need to impose quality guards, right? Like we need to think about how do we actually measure and control what's happening in production. And this is where we've really seen the story of observability come in, where teams need to be able to understand and measure what's happening in production and understand why did my latest release not work correctly, right? Why is this broken for one particular subset of users, and how do I fix it for them? Which I think then naturally brings us to feature management and brings us naturally to kind of the controllability side, right? Observability and controllability are, in control theory, duals of each other, right? So you kind of have this notion of, okay, you can see what's happening in production now. How do you affect it without having to restart the whole system? How do you make sure that you have the control knobs that you need to maintain system stability, even in the face of a ever-increasing complexity of systems that we're building?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love that idea of measuring releases. And so, feature management, observability definitely work in tandem. I also think about it not just in terms of the operational metrics, which are incredibly critical and sort of like a day zero, tier zero need for teams, but also in terms of making sure, to your words, that people aren't shipping shit in terms of like customer impact. Are we building things that customers want to use? And there, I think we're seeing a lot of like a next wave of experimentation, and feature management is one part of that story as well. It's 2023, it's the middle of the year, and AI has taken the world by storm, and so it would be remiss for us to not have a little bit of a conversation about AI. Do you have any thoughts about how generative AI might impact the software development and software release landscape?
I think one of the challenges of generative AI is that at the end of the day, an AI is not going to run your entire system for you. It's not going to respond to your pages. So we can use AI to automate some of the things that a human being could do perfectly well, but that is rote and boring. I think the kind of more creative uses of AI have the potential to create code that no one actually understands, that they just check in to get and hope that no one complains about it. And when that does break, there will be no one, not even the person who originally checked it in, who actually understands like what it's doing, why it's doing that, how it can be fixed. So I think in that context, a lot of how I and Honeycomb have been thinking about the field of not just AI and neural networks and machine learning, but kind of machine assistance in general, is that tools should be there to help you, to empower you, to kind of extend your reach, rather than being this omnipresent force that is outside of your control, that is messing with you. So think MechaSuit, not Skynet.
Yeah, it's very much that sort of like assistant or co-pilot idea. I'm just shuddering imagining a world in which a highly regulated software company is releasing software where none of the developers actually know what it does. I think we're a long ways off from that, or hopefully we are. One of the things we were chatting about in the context of this question is anomaly detection and how some of the naive approaches to detecting anomalies don't work. Do you want to share some of your insights? I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, I think that when you have very high dimensionality and cardinality, so where dimensionality is, for instance, the number of feature flags that you have, and cardinality is the number of possible values per feature flag, but it could really be any dimension, and things like user ID, things like build ID, things like region, language, right? These are situations where naive anomaly detection will start seeing ghosts in the machine, right? Where you'll start saying, with p less than 0.01, aka 99% confidence intervals, that there is a problem here. But it turns out if you're running that machine analysis 100 times and you have 100 different dimensions, of course one of them is going to come up as an anomaly at all times. And also it turns out that software releases, changes in feature flags, those are all change from the perspective of the system. Good change, bad change. An anomaly detection system is not necessarily going to be able to know. So I think it's much better to start from the perspective of, here's a problem that I have noticed because of a violation of my SLO or because of an investigation I'm doing into something that I feel is anomalous. Show me what dimensions and values are correlated with that, rather than kind of starting from all of the data and then finding anomalies everywhere in it.
I think that is a great insight, and it certainly can be an enormous waste of time chasing these phantoms down when you start looking for problems instead of starting from the expectations of the system behavior as defined by SLOs, for example. One of the things that we see is that there's this huge discrepancy between organizations that are delivering software and elite companies that are delivering software. I know that some of the Accelerate work touched on this. What are you seeing in terms of the differences between those elite teams that are delivering software fast and with great quality, with great customer impact, versus the teams that are just stepping into that world?
That's a really great question, and I think the Accelerate State of DevOps reports as of late have really illuminated that teams that are high performing have an easy time becoming elite performing, but that there is still this set of laggards that are in the low to medium performance camp who are not making it to being high performance. And if you look at what the DORA metrics say in terms of delay between when a change is checked in versus when it goes out, in terms of time to break and fix software, I think that what we find is that those challenges are fundamentally around accelerating the initial, kind of priming the pump to get CI and CD going. So as much as I did say earlier, CI and CD are not enough by themselves to create an elite team, they are absolutely necessary ingredients to create a high-performing team. You just don't get to elite that way. Because at the end of the day, no amount of feature flagging or no amount of observability is necessarily going to help you if you are constrained in your ability to ship a longer standing fix to an issue by having a CD process that takes multiple days to complete and requires manual intervention, or if you wind up having manual software releases that are done every 3 months or 6 months, I think there we really need to focus on those fundamentals of repeatable, automated software releases first, and then we can kind of start layering in those additional degrees of visibility and controllability.
Would you say those are kind of like the first investments you would make if you're in the position of being one of those software companies that wants to make that step into high-performing status?
I would definitely agree. That being said, I don't think that it's of no value to invest in observability or feature management. I just think that you need to make sure that you're also accompanying it with a shift towards more rapid fire release trains. You can definitely get some degree of you can make people feel more comfortable with the idea of shipping software more quickly if you know that there are control knobs, if you know that you have the ability to see what's happening, right? So I think that that is a carrot that can help people along the way to having better CI and CD, but I don't think that you can kind of realize the full benefits from observability and feature management without kind of a faster release cadence.
Yeah. One of the things I've observed with some of LaunchDarkly's larger customers is that there's this tension between wanting to move quickly and deploy more quickly, but then also to have some of the change controls that you need, and especially some of these either regulated industries or in companies that have strict change management practices. How are you seeing organizations deal with that tension, the tension between wanting to deploy quickly and then the tension between that and sort of like wanting to have guardrails in place, wanting to have a human manually check things? We know that things like change approval boards from Work and Accelerate and other places don't really work, but what are you seeing in terms of how companies are accomplishing those seemingly things that are at odds or capabilities that are at odds with each other?
I think for a long time, there is this mantra in heavily regulated industries that had Sarbanes-Oxley requirements or that had other financial reporting safeguard requirements, that they said that you have to have a separate team operate the software as you have deploy this, as you have write the software. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's true. If you look at what the regulations say, what they say is that you have to have appropriate controls in place such that no one person alone can push software to production without review by someone else. But that approval doesn't have to happen at a change board level when the deploy goes out. You can actually choose to do that control at code review time before things get checked in, and that kind of maximizes the amount of state available to the people when they are doing that change review. So in terms of access to production systems, again, I think that it is true that it is not a good practice to have individual developers SSHing to individual machines to poke around on them. But I think even today, a lot of teams would concede it's also not a good practice for people who are in so-called operations or software operations centers to be SSHing to machines either. Yeah. So I think basically the more we can get away from needing human touches on systems, the more we make it feasible for software development teams to self-regulate with CI and CD gates and appropriate observability to be able to inspect the system state non-destructively and without kind of tripping any of these concerns over who operates versus who writes the software. The answer is you can have software development teams write their own software, observe the results in production, and make tweaks using feature flagging if they need to, or doing a new deploy with a new code approval.
Yeah, it sounds like from an organizational perspective, that is the best way to sort of empower teams within the constraints that are required by Sarbanes-Oxley or other compliance requirements or regulatory requirements. There's another thread there that I want to pull on, which is the role of automation in some of these companies. Again, there seems to be this tension between wanting to have humans involved in the process to be that final guardrail of approval around change landing in production, versus this idea that humans can introduce inconsistency into the process, and actually what we want is automation. I'm curious if you have thoughts on that front.
Yeah, I definitely feel that as we were talking about change control boards earlier, those boards are devoid of context. They don't know enough about what the nature of the change being released is. All they kind of have are summary statistics of, oh, this team has released, has put out 5 changes that they said were medium risk and one of them failed. Therefore, we need to clamp down on this team's, medium risk. They don't actually know what's going on with that individual team. So again, I think it's a case where the team itself is empowered to have a better sense of what's going on at the time that they write the code. And that kind of avoids the problem of decisions being made inconsistently or otherwise kind of having a false sense of safety from having a human being perform a pro forma check that says, okay, 99 out of 100 of this team's last releases went okay, so we're going to approve this one, right? Like, how do you know, right? I think that it's much better to have these signals of having gates that are kind of guarding releases, and those gates have to be based off of what's the actual performance of the software, right? Have we introduced any regressions? And to enforce that automatically rather than have a human being squint at it.
I think that's a great segue into my next question, which touches on topics actually that we talked about earlier. We talked a little bit about how teams are measuring the impact of their releases, and we talked about observability and feature management being 2 key components to that process. How are you seeing great elite teams using those 2 capabilities together to improve their release processes?
I think that we do need to back up a step and first talk about service level objectives. So the idea of a service level objective, or SLO, is that it enables us to define what the product requirement is for reliability, because reliability is a feature of a product. And therefore, we need to decide what is the level of service we're trying to provide so that we can make the appropriate investments in the controllability, in the visibility, and in how we think about whether we should be moving faster or slower. So without that signal, it's really, really hard to decide how we are going to measure that tension between shipping faster and having appropriate degrees of safety. So once you define what are your critical user journeys, once you define what are your indicators, your service level indicators that help you measure the success of those critical user journeys, at that point you can start using observability and feature management to keep your SLO as something that you're able to proactively manage to, rather than have a situation where the SLO is just a number on a dashboard that you look at once a quarter and be like, oops, we missed our SLO last quarter, oh well, right? Instead, you can more proactively say, we are currently trending towards spending roughly 70% of our error budget. So if our target is 99% success and we're actually trending towards 99.3% success, right, that's a sign that we're actually doing a good job. But if we are burning significantly worse than that, if it looks like we are a software deployment went out or someone flipped a feature flag and suddenly that rate of burn starts increasing, then we know that we need to roll back that release or feature flag off the thing that went out in that release in order to keep that under control. Similarly, observability helps us understand which feature flags are the ones that are going to give us the appropriate control, right? Which users are impacted, which experiments are going on, and that kind of helps us get a grasp of what we need to actually change rather than kind of flipping flags at random and seeing what end breaks them.
Liz, I know that Honeycomb are LaunchDarkly customers, and LaunchDarkly uses Honeycomb as well as our observability tooling. Can you tell us a story about how the 2 tools have worked together to create a great customer outcome at Honeycomb?
So at Honeycomb right now, we are doing some changes to our ingest pipeline. And our ingest pipeline is one of the most reliability sensitive and latency sensitive aspects of our code base, because we only really get one chance to ingest customer events. So some of the changes that we're making include having better caching of the metadata and of the schema of the events that we're receiving from our clients. And we're able to run both systems in parallel and use feature flagging to direct which of the incoming events are processed through which of the pipelines, which really has helped us significantly de-risk that portion of kind of changing the wheels on the car while the car is in motion, ingesting 2.5 million events per second. We're able to divert some portion of that into the new metadata processing system to make sure that it's working correctly. And if it breaks, right, like we have attached the value of that LaunchDarkly flag to all of the events that are processed so that we can determine very, very quickly if there is a problem that is correlated to that flag so that we know to turn it off or to turn it off for specific customers that are exhibiting pathological behavior with that feature flag on.
That's amazing. Like I said, we're Honeycomb customers as well, and I'd love to share a story about how we've used Honeycomb and LaunchDarkly together. So we actually had a multi-month project here at LaunchDarkly that, among other things, revamped our context ingestion pipeline. We call the new capability custom context, and it's been really a differentiator in terms of how customers are able to use LaunchDarkly as a feature management platform. And we spent months testing this in pre-production environments, and there were some really significant performance challenges with it that we thought we'd nailed. And as we began a rollout into production, we began observing some anomalies through Honeycomb. And eventually we traced it down using Honeycomb and realized that a handful of customers, to the point that you were bringing up earlier, were exhibiting some pathological behaviors. And so we were able to sort of like cordon them off and roll them back into the old ingestion pipeline, and then deal with some performance issues that only those customers were observing. And we were able to do that while keeping the rest of the release rolling forward smoothly, and that was an incredible value add for us, both internally in terms of how we rolled the project out, and for our customers in terms of minimizing the negative impact that they were seeing.
Yeah, I think that functionality is one of the things that the engineers on our teams are very excited about, because of the ability to actually be able to flag individual servers on and off, and not just on the basis of users or team IDs.
Yeah, that's how we think of it. We're using LaunchDarkly more and more, and our customers have been telling us more and more that they're using LaunchDarkly to control rollouts of all sorts of changes, from infrastructure, database migrations, API changes, and more, and that capability really helps out with that.
I'm really excited to see what people build with feature flagging and observability together.
Yeah. Imagine you're at a company that is sort of just getting started on their DevOps journey, and they haven't adopted an observability platform, and maybe they haven't adopted a feature management platform. What are some of the things that you look at as ways to get started on this path?
I think the answer with regard to observability is that you cannot possibly go wrong with OpenTelemetry right now. There are a wide variety of vendors out there that all support OpenTelemetry. And therefore, if you start using OpenTelemetry's automatic instrumentation, it will start giving you out-of-the-box visibility, pretty much regardless of what programming language you're using these days. And it will generate the data in a format that you can feed to any number of tools. Certainly, we at Honeycomb would appreciate your business, but also we think that competition is important, that it enables people to innovate rather than feel like they're locked into an incumbent provider. With regard to feature management, I think that that's something where certainly you could choose to implement rudimentary feature management yourself, and see how that goes, and kind of get an idea of whether that's right for you and your company. But at a certain scale, right, at the point that it's not just something that you're toying around with, where it's something that you are deploying to maybe thousands, maybe millions of customers, you really are going to want the benefit of a feature management platform like LaunchDarkly, where you can avoid the need to do a bunch of undifferentiated heavy lifting around things like what happens if the feature management service is unavailable, right? Like what are your fallbacks? Or how do you make sure that you are serving predictable results and recording what feature values were sent out, right? Like these are things that LaunchDarkly has thought about that you shouldn't have to think about. So, yes, right, like if you're just getting started, rolling your own is a viable start, but you're going to want to pretty quickly transition over to the SDK of a vendor like LaunchDarkly.
If you were an engineer or an engineering manager at a company, and you wanted to justify an investment into an observability tool like Honeycomb or a feature management tool like LaunchDarkly, what are some of the arguments that you would make around justifying the ROI of these tools?
I think it boils down to, we are here to do the job of delivering software that delights our customers. And anything that gets in the way of that is something that we want to mitigate. So if we have, first, I'd argue to invest in CI and CD if you don't have that already. But after that, I think it's really, really crucial to say, I want to be able to understand what's happening with my users in production. I don't want to be surprised by customer success calling me up and saying, hey, there's this one user that is saying they're repeatedly encountering problems. Why is your dashboard green, right? Why does it say that there's no problems in the system? Similarly, if you are in the process of delivering a lot of software very quickly, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate levels of control over it so that you're not reverting 100 people's different commits. If you have an issue, you would rather just turn off the one thing that is causing a problem. And that's not even getting into the full landscape of being able to do experiments on individual populations of users rather than just enable or disable like individual features. I think that having the ability to experiment using feature flags is so crucial in terms of being able to take a few more risks, right? If your error budget is in good shape, then you can say, I'm going to conduct an experiment where I turn on a feature flag for a population of users, knowing that I can turn it off very quickly, knowing that the blast radius is contained, right? Like these are things that enable us to try things out on a smaller subset before we roll them out to 100%.
Awesome. Let me ask you a slightly broader question. What are you looking forward to in 2023? What do you see on the horizon? What's coming up next?
I think, as we were discussing, the AI wave is sweeping across the field, and I think it's going to be really important to differentiate between which companies are doing things just to say they're doing it, which companies are doing things that are taking control and agency away from your developers, and which things are genuinely going to improve and kind of force multiply what your developers can do. I think also we're seeing a number of things happen in terms of more kinds of signals that we can get out of our software. So we're starting to see increases in adoption of technology like eBPF that can basically reach into the kernel and kind of hook into code to kind of lower that lift so that you may not even necessarily need to make a single line of code change in order to get observability for the first time into what your software is doing.
Fascinating stuff. Last piece of advice. If you could give a piece of advice to an engineering manager that was looking to empower their developers, what would you focus them in on?
I think that you have to have that feedback loop from your developers of what is causing them the most pain, to kind of make sure that you are understanding what is it that people, not just what are people complaining about, but what have people kind of silently accepted in their heads, right? Like as, oh, this is never going to change, right? But it's causing me friction. So one classic thing that I harp on a lot is build times. That it is a tax on every developer the longer they have to wait to get feedback on their changes. Because at the end of the day, yes, running things in production is the best way to find out how they're actually going to perform. But we're saying, test in production, but that doesn't mean, don't test at all pre-prod. It just means, run the appropriate set of checks in pre-prod. So in the case of Honeycomb, we wind up ensuring we have actually a service level objective on our build times. If our build times take longer than 12 minutes, that is a failure in our view, because that means that developers are sitting there waiting too long for feedback. And that has really subtle and nefarious downstream effects. So kind of focusing on that cycle time, on that build time is one example of something where elsewhere, you might just have build times creep from 10 minutes to 15 minutes to 20 minutes, right? And no one's complaining and saying the build is slow, but yet that's something that is eating into their development time. So kind of really getting a sense of what's the friction that is standing in the way between a developer writing something and it being used in the field by some population of users. Maybe not 100%, but some users, and then investing in making that feedback loop shorter.
How do you think about engineering leaders investing in those types of initiatives? So the SLO example is a great one. It sounds like SLO is breached, that triggers work immediately. Is that organized as a platform team within Honeycomb or in some other manner?
We have actually gone through this process recently at Honeycomb of splitting up our singular on-call rotation into multiple different on-call rotations and having durable product teams that own subsets of the Honeycomb functionality, including the SLOs for that functionality. So while there are some kind of cross-cutting things that always reach the platform team, like if core ingest is down, that's something that our whole platform team's current on-call is going to get. But I think kind of the ownership and empowerment piece is how you get teams to really think about and internalize and adopt SLOs rather than, we don't want to recreate the problem of silos and throwing things over the fence, right? And having SLOs that only platform engineers or SREs look at.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights on the state of software releases in 2023.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I learned a lot too.
I hope you all enjoyed the conversation as much as I did, and please join us for the rest of the content throughout the day.